Welcome to CNN's Special Report, Diversity Through American History. Starring Nolan, Catherine Burns, and Tabitha Miller. The Native Americans were the original inhabitants of North America and had an estimated population of up to 60 million. However, this number was diminished due to forced labor and foreign disease. Chief Pontiac was the leader of Pontiac's War, an attempt to resist the inevitable assimilation of Native American culture. The Proclamation of 1763 declared all land west of the Appalachian Mountains to be inhabited by the Native Americans. This was later violated by the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance declared the Midwestern Territory, previously seen as Native American territory, as owned by the United States government. Therefore, this encouraged white settlement of these lands and a continued eradication of the Native American population and culture. The first African Americans were forcibly brought over in 1619 and sold into the slave trade. By 1790, 700,000 populated the United States. Slavery in the United States during this period was characterized by the Cotton Belt plantations. The largest and most undermining legislation would be the Three-Fifths Compromise, which essentially stated African Americans as not fully human. This is along with hundreds of slave codes and laws of states. African American culture included voodoo religion, a mixture of folk and Christianity, as well as black Protestant churches. Music and storytelling became cultural pillars. The majority of U.S. citizens were of European descent. 2 million in 1790 were English, while 400,000 were of other European descent. A large group of the latter were the Irish who came for work and religious freedom. The New England states became segregated in their racial composition, such as New York, Dutch and Europeans, Massachusetts, Anglo-Saxon, and Pennsylvania, which became home to many Europeans.
From the 1800s to the 1900s, the Native American population decreased significantly due to continued land restriction by white legislators. The U.S. put many laws in place that restricted Native American rights, such as the Indian Removal Act and the Dawes Act. They slowly took away their land and put them on reservations that continually got smaller. Their way of life became threatened as the Europeans began killing the buffalo, their major food supply. The Native Americans were forced to fight for their rights in many battles such as Sand Creek, Little Bighorn, and Wounded Knee. As time went on, they were forced to assimilate but were still being discriminated against without proper intervention by the U.S. government. Due to the natural reproduction of African Americans, their population increased considerably. White settlers did not consider them to be humans and treated them like animals. African Americans had barely any rights. Toward the mid-1800s, slaves and free African Americans began to fight for their rights and freedom and held many revolts. Many Northerners sympathized with the African Americans, which caused the South to secede. The result was the start of the Civil War. During the Civil War, President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation to free all slaves. However, racism was still prevalent with black codes and Jim Crow laws. Peace, love, diversity. In 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was created to pressure employers, labor unions, and the government on behalf of African Americans. This organization became one of the most important civil rights organizations in the country and pushed for equal treatment and rights of African Americans. In the period of time after World War II, African Americans had benefited, but were still a seriously disadvantaged group. Those who had left the South for better opportunities in northern and western cities were concentrated in blighted and segregated neighborhoods, working at low-paying jobs, suffering economic and social discrimination, and failing to share fully in post-war prosperity. In the South, laws forced blacks to live almost totally segregated from white society. Rising expectations of African Americans in the post-war years led them to challenge old patterns of racial segregation. The civil rights movement in the 1960s raised expectations of urban African Americans for improvement. Frustration mounted as they failed to experience any significant economic gain. Several people went to extremes for ethnic separation. At the Poor People's March on Washington in 1968, the greatest advocator of African American rights, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was assassinated. In 2004, African Americans formed the second largest of the nation's ethnic minorities. There were just over 39 million in the U.S., and 13.4% of the population was African American. They made substantial gains in education, work, and social life during this time, but black poverty rates were still very high. The Mexican Revolution of 1910 resulted in a flood of immigrants into the United States. The choices for Americans who opposed the fighting were either to hide away or to leave the country, so many Mexicans, hoping to avoid the turmoil and danger of war, the economic catastrophe, and the social chaos, chose to head north, immigrating to the United States. More than 890,000 legal Mexican immigrants came to the United States between 1910 and 1920, several hired to work on the railroads. By the 1970s, Mexican Americans were at the forefront of active ethnic groups. The primary impulse came from efforts of Cesar Chavez to organize the poorly paid grape pickers and lettuce workers in California into the National Farm Workers Association. He appealed to ethnic nationalism in mobilizing Mexican American field hands to strike against grape growers in 1965. The 5-year struggle resulted in a Union victory in 1970, but 95% of farmers involved lost their homes and cars. Responding to racial fears in California after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt approved an army order in February 1942 to move all Japanese Americans on the West Coast to concentration camps in the interior. Forced to sell their farms and businesses at distressed prices, the Japanese Americans lost not only their liberty but also most of their worldly goods. More than 5,000 renounced their American citizenship and chose to live in Japan at war's end. Japanese Americans never experienced the torture and mass death of the German concentration camps, but their treatment was a disgrace to a nation fighting for freedom and democracy. In the beginning of the 21st century, Asian Americans were the fastest growing minority group. The Chinese formed the largest single group of Asian Americans, followed by Filipinos, Japanese, Indians, Koreans, and Vietnamese. Immigration was the main reason for this rapid growth for all those groups except the Japanese. During the 1980s, Asia had provided nearly half of all immigrants to the United States. They were all well educated and affluent, and many succeeded. In 1924, Congress passed the Indian Citizenship Act, granting U.S. citizenship to Native Americans. However, several nations, including the Hopi and the Iroquois, declined citizenship in favor of retaining sovereign nationhood. Native Americans, after years of neglect, fared slightly under Roosevelt's New Deal. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act, a reform measure designed to emphasize tribal unity, attempting to transform Indians into self-sufficient farmers. It supported educational programs and native handiwork. Despite moderate gains, however, the nation's 1/3 million Indians remained the most impoverished citizens in America. Polish, Italian, and Czech groups insisted on respect for their nationalities. Congress acknowledged these demands with the passage of the Ethnic Heritage Studies Act of 1972. Instead of trying to melt all of them down into a standard American type, Congress now gave what one sponsor of the measure called official recognition to ethnicity as a positive, constructive force in our society today. By the 1990s, the flow of immigration into the United States reached record proportions as a result of new policies adopted in 1965. The number of arrivals continued to grow, and by the 2000s, a record high of 35 million foreign-born persons lived in the United States. This composed 12% of the population.
Half of them came from Latin America, 1/4 from Asia, and 1/7 from Europe. The influx of people from all around the world had profound implications for American culture, but this image carried with it the concept of stripping newcomers of their culture and national traits and casting them into an Anglo-Saxon mold. Instead of recasting the immigrants into this American type, immigration could better be seen as broadening the diversity that had always characterized the United States. The new awareness of ethnic diversity manifested itself in education, cultural identity, and pride.
See you next time, Mom. CNN.
Spread that diversity.